Errol Flynn. I remember that when I was young, I'd go to every Errol Flynn movie I could find. Captain Blood, Dodge City, and every time I would leave the theater, I'd have an imaginary sword at my side and a crooked little smile on my lips, and I'd be looking for some damsel in distress that I could rescue. I read everything. I loved Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, the Hardy Boys, King Arthur and his Knights, the Odyssey, everything I could get my hands on. I loved Charles Dickens. I read Shakespeare. I didn't understand all of it, I suspect, but I loved the language. I loved Omar Khayyam, Cyrano de Bergerac. My mother said I would read the labels on ketchup bottles if there was nothing else around. I think that every one of us, we're influenced by everybody we know, by everything we see, by every experience we've ever had. So, of course, while I was in high school, I had a part-time job writing obituaries for a news service. And I would write obituaries of famous living people. You know, when celebrities die, their obituary is already, it appears in the paper in 5 minutes, and you wonder, how did they write it that quickly? Well, those things, they're on a file, you know, and I was one of the guys who wrote them. I quit after a while. It got too depressing, writing about living people in the past tense. Then I did publicity writing for a hospital. I never was quite sure if I'm supposed to be convincing people to get sick to go to that hospital or what. And I did all kind of crazy things. And then when I graduated high school, I saw an ad in the paper that a publishing company was looking for a writer. And I answered the ad. I didn't even know it was a comic book company. And I got there, it was comics, and I stayed there ever since. Oh, yes, I used to be embarrassed. People would ask, what do you do? And at that time, I had now come back from the Army. I went back to the job. I was in my early 20s, and I felt somehow when you're that age, working for a comic book company, that's embarrassing. So I'd say to people, I'm a writer, and I'd try to walk away, and then they'd say, well, what do you write? And I still kept trying to finesse it. I'd say, children's stories, and I'd walk away further, but they'd keep following, and sooner or later I had to say comic books, and then they would walk away. You know? Well, in those days, most of my favorites were reprints of the newspaper comics. There was Smitty and Dick Tracy, and I don't even remember most of them. First assignment I got as a writing assignment was just a few days after I started working. In those days, the comic books, in order to be considered magazines, this was a legal thing by the post office, and they had to be considered magazines or else they couldn't mail them cheaply for their subscribers. So every comic book had to have 2 pages of prose in each book. For some reason, the post office felt if there aren't 2 pages with just words and no pictures, you can't consider it a magazine. Well, nobody read those 2 pages of prose. They were just put in there to satisfy this statute. I was the guy. That was my first assignment. I wrote a 2-page prose story, and I wrote quite a number of them. Then after that, they let me write comic strips. I might have gotten $1. I think my page rate at the time was 50 cents a page, and that turned out to be 2 pages. Yeah, hey, to me it was found money. Joe Simon was apparently the boss, and he walked around puffing a big cigar, and he talked in a very deep voice, and he was great. I liked him. He had a lot of personality. And Jack would sit hunched over the drawing board and do most of the actual artwork, also puffing a big cigar, and I liked him too, and it was great watching him draw. No, they were terrific. In those days, everybody was just busy doing his work, you know. There was a lot of pressure to turn those things out in time, and there wasn't too much time for practical jokes. Well, you know, there were so many publishing companies in those days. We were larger than some and smaller than others, and it really was no different than it is now. I mean, it's a funny thing about competing. you are competing as you do your work, but you're not thinking of it in those terms. I mean, all we were thinking of was, what story will we get for the next issue? How do we draw it? How do we color it? Will we have it in time? So when you're doing your work, you're not thinking of competing with Brand X. You're just thinking of what you're doing. And I was never really aware of competing that much. And I don't think the other people were either. We were just, can we get our work out on time, and is it good? That was the big thing. He was a presence, definitely, but he wasn't a troop rally. Martin mostly stayed in his own office. And when we would finish a cover or something, I would bring it in and show it to Martin. No, he stayed mostly within the confines of his executive office. Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal, one of my favorites. I think that was done by Al Jaffe, who's now a big staffer, an important staffer at Mad Magazine. Hunger is a great spur. To me, writing was writing. I mean, if we had to write humor stories, we wrote humor stories. If I had to write westerns, I wrote westerns. In fact, I remember I used to hire the writers after I became the editor, and sometimes I'd be interviewing a writer, and I'd say, okay, I think you're okay. Here's a Western story to do. And he would say to me, Jim, sorry, I don't write Westerns. I only write mystery stories, detective stories. And I'd say to him, but they're the same thing. A story's a story. In the detective story, you say, follow that car. And in the Western, you say, follow that stagecoach. Or in the detective story, you say, stick 'em up, buddy. And in the Western, you say, stick 'em up, hombre. But, it's a story. So I'm probably crazy because I've learned since that there are people who specialize in certain types. But I always felt, if you write, you write. Romance stories, horror stories, war stories, humor stories, they're all the same. No. I just wrote what had to be written. I guess business was terrible. It was a case of... I don't remember specific. I've got the worst memory in the world. My guess is the only thing that it could have been is the books weren't selling. It was terrible because I got the job of letting the staff go. Martin said to me, Stan, you got to fire everybody, and then he took off somewhere. And I had to tell all these people that I had been working with for so many years, that's it, guys, you're out of a job. That was one of the low points of my life. In fact, we had to do that twice, as I remember. It happened twice in our career, and it was terrible.